Or what, exactly? Gonna go cry to your sister again? Then hands grabbed his jacket, and Silas Calloway went stumbling backward toward a stack of steel pipes. He never hit them. Something moved faster than anyone in that parking lot could follow. One hand caught his shoulder and turned his fall aside. The other stopped a grown man's arm cold, mid-swing, with a precision nobody expected from a quiet farm girl in muddy boots. 2 seconds. That was all it took. Tucker stepped back, rubbing his wrist, staring at her like he'd touched something he didn't understand. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Josie Calloway said nothing. She simply stood between her brother and 3 boys who thought they'd picked an easy target. They had no idea what she'd done before she came home. They had no idea what was pinned to that muddy cap, and in 9 days this entire town would find out. There is a kind of quiet you only find in farm country. It settles over the fields before sunrise. It sits in the porch boards of old houses. It waits in the hearts of people who have lost something and haven't quite finished grieving it. This is a story about that kind of quiet. It belongs to a young woman named Josie Calloway and to her younger brother Silas. It belongs to a small town called Millbrook, tucked into farm country most maps barely bother to name. A town that thought it knew exactly who these 2 strangers were the moment they rolled into it. It didn't. Not even close. Not yet. The truck rattled down County Road 9 just after 6 in the morning. Fog still clung low to the ditches on either side. Josie kept both hands steady on the wheel. Silas sat beside her, forehead against the window, half asleep. Behind them, a small trailer carried what was left of their old life. 2 suitcases, a few boxes of kitchen things, their mother's quilt folded neat on top. The one thing neither of them had been willing to pack carelessly. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch of road. They didn't need to. 3 weeks earlier, a phone call had changed everything they thought they understood about the next year of their lives. Their grandfather, Earl Calloway, had passed quietly in his sleep. Heart simply gave out, the doctor said. A gentle way to go for a man who'd lived a stubborn, hard-working, occasionally loud enough life. He left them the farm. 60 acres of corn, hay, and fences that had seen better decades. A house with a leaning porch, a roof that needed work, and floors that creaked in places that felt almost like they were greeting you. And a debt neither of them fully understood yet, tucked inside a folder they hadn't found the courage to open. Josie had been overseas when the call came through. She didn't talk about where exactly. Not to strangers. Not even to most people who asked directly, careful as they tried to be about it. She'd come home 3 months before that, already discharged, already trying to figure out who she was supposed to be without a uniform telling her. Losing her grandfather so soon after felt, some days, like losing solid ground twice in the same year. Silas had taken it harder, in his own quieter way. He was 18, freshly graduated from high school back east, still deciding what kind of man he wanted to become. He'd been planning to study agriculture somewhere, someday, in some vague future he hadn't rushed to picture clearly. Now someday had arrived early, uninvited, and considerably more complicated than he'd imagined. The truck crested a small rise, and Millbrook came into view below them. A water tower with faded lettering. A grain elevator standing taller than anything else around it. A main street lined with maybe a dozen shops, half of them still waiting for their morning lights to switch on. "That's it?" Silas asked, sitting up straighter. "That's it," Josie said. "Grandpa always made it sound bigger." "Grandpa made a lot of things sound bigger than they were," Josie said, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. Man could turn a trip to the feed store into an adventure. Silas almost smiled. Almost. They pulled onto the farm just as the sun broke fully over the tree line, gold light spilling slowly across the fields. The house looked smaller than Josie remembered from childhood summers. Paint peeling near the window frames. Grass grown high and unruly around the fence posts. But the land itself, gold and green and impossibly wide, still managed to take her breath for a moment. "We're really doing this," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Josie put the truck in park and sat still for a moment, letting the engine tick as it cooled. "We are," she said. "One day at a time. That's how anything worth doing actually gets done." That first week they worked from before dawn until their hands ached and their backs protested every step toward bed. Fixing fence line, post by stubborn post. Clearing the barn of decades of accumulated clutter. Learning where every creak and groan in the old house came from, and which ones meant nothing at all. Josie moved through the labor with a kind of stillness that surprised even herself. She didn't waste motion. She didn't waste words. Years of training had left their mark on her, even in the smallest ordinary things. The way she scanned a room before fully entering it. The way she noticed exits, angles, the small details other people walked past without a second glance. Old habits, she told herself, whenever she caught herself doing it. Just old habits, and nothing more worth mentioning. Silas noticed some of it, though he never pressed her about it. He'd learned, over the years, exactly when not to ask. Whatever his sister had seen out there, wherever out there had actually been, she would tell him when she was finally ready. Maybe, if ever. For now, there was a farm to save, and an entirely new town to face together. Silas had already enrolled at Millbrook Community College in the agriculture program their grandfather used to mention with unmistakable pride. Small classes, real fieldwork instead of textbooks alone. A genuine chance to learn the kind of farming that might actually keep 60 acres alive for another generation. His first day arrived on a bright, unremarkable Tuesday morning. Josie drove him into town in the old truck, windows cracked, radio humming low static and country music underneath it. "You nervous?" she asked. "A little," Silas admitted, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "That's normal. Everybody carries a little of that on a first day." "Were you ever nervous? Your first day, wherever that ended up being?" Josie kept her eyes steady on the road ahead. "Everybody's nervous the first day," she said. "The trick nobody tells you is that it doesn't disappear. You just get better at not letting it show on your face." Silas laughed under his breath, a small, genuine sound. "Easy for you to say. Nothing about it was ever easy," she said quietly. "Doesn't mean it can't still be true." They pulled up outside the small brick building that served as the college's main hall. Students crossed the lawn in loose, unhurried clusters, laughing, talking, checking their phones. Silas grabbed his bag from the floorboard. "Pick you up at 3? Josie asked. "Yeah, thanks, Joe." She watched him walk toward the entrance, shoulders held a little too stiff, clearly working hard to look like a person who already belonged there. Something in her chest tightened, unexpected and familiar all at once. She knew that particular walk. She'd worn it herself once, more than once, entering rooms full of strangers who had no idea yet what she was capable of. By mid-morning, Josie was back at the farm, wrestling a stubborn fence post out of the packed ground. That was when she heard an unfamiliar truck coming slowly down the drive. An older man in a faded ball cap climbed out carefully, one hand steadying himself against the door. "You must be Earl's granddaughter," he called across the yard. Josie straightened, wiping her hands against her jeans. "That's me, Josie. Vernon Higgins." He extended a weathered, sun-spotted hand. "Lived next door to your grandpa the better part of 40 years. His grip was firm, surprisingly steady for a man his age. "He used to talk about you," Vernon said. "You and your brother both. Awfully proud of the two of you, if you want the honest truth." Something caught in Josie's throat, unexpected and sudden. "He never talked much about himself," she said. "We're still learning a lot of things about this place and him, one piece at a time." Vernon looked slowly around at the fence line, the leaning barn, the wide fields stretching beyond it. "Your grandfather kept this place alive through some genuinely hard years," he said. "Droughts, bad markets. Man was stubborn as an old mule the whole way through it." "Sounds about right. From what I remember, you'll do just fine here," Vernon said. "I can already tell. How's that?" He nodded toward the fence post she'd been wrestling with when he arrived. "Most folks your age would have called somebody else by now," he said. "You're still out here handling it yourself. No complaints." Josie allowed herself a small, tired smile. Never grew up with a whole lot of someone else's to call, honestly. Vernon studied her a moment longer than felt entirely ordinary. Something quiet and searching in his expression. There was something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or simply the careful attention of an old man who had witnessed a great many things across a long life, and never quite lost the habit of noticing. "Well," he said finally, "you need anything at all. We're just down the road. Don't be a stranger out here." "Thank you, Mr. Higgins, Vernon," he corrected, almost gently. "Mr. Higgins was my father, rest him." He climbed back into his truck, offered a small wave, and drove off in a slow cloud of gravel dust. Josie stood there a moment, watching him disappear around the bend. Something about the brief encounter stayed with her longer than it probably should have. Inside the main hall at Millbrook Community College, Silas found his way toward the agriculture wing. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of smell that somehow made a strange place feel slightly less strange. A dozen or so students sat scattered among the desks, most of them quiet, a few laughing too loudly at jokes only they understood. Silas took a seat near the back, notebook open, pen ready, doing his best impression of someone who wasn't nervous at all. That was when the door swung open, and 3 young men walked in like the room already belonged to them. At the front of them was a lean, sharp-featured freshman named Holt Sinclair. Everyone in the room seemed to already know exactly who he was. A few students nodded in easy greeting. A few others looked away entirely, careful not to draw attention. Holt scanned the room, spotted the empty seat beside Sksa, and dropped into it without bothering to ask. "New guy," he said, barely glancing over. "Farm kid?" "Something like that," Silas said evenly. "Which farm?" "The old Calloway place, out on County Road 9. Holt's eyebrows rose slightly, something calculating behind the casual expression. "That place. Heard the old man finally kicked it a few weeks back." Heat rose fast in Silas's neck. "That old man was my grandfather," he said, voice level despite the anger underneath it. Holt shrugged, entirely unbothered by the correction. "No offense meant. Just heard the land's basically worthless without some real investment behind it." "It's not for sale," Silas said. "Didn't say it was." Holt smiled, easy and careless, in a way that felt deliberately practiced. Yet, before Silas could answer that, the instructor called the class to order, and the moment slid past unfinished. But something about it stayed lodged in his chest, sharp and uncomfortable, for the rest of the morning. At lunch, Silas sat alone at the edge of the courtyard, eating a sandwich Josie had packed for him that morning. A few tables away, he noticed a young woman sitting entirely by herself as well. Quiet, dark-haired, a stack of textbooks beside an untouched plate of food. Every so often, a group of students at the next table over would glance her way and laugh, low and pointed. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, cheeks flushed with something that looked a lot like humiliation. Silas didn't know her name yet. That would come soon enough. For now, he simply felt an odd, familiar discomfort, watching someone else sit alone the exact way he was sitting alone. He almost said something, almost stood up and crossed the distance between them. He didn't, not that particular day. But he remembered the look on her face for a long while afterward, the way you remember small, unfinished moments that quietly matter more than they seem to at the time. That afternoon, Josie arrived early to pick Silas up from campus. She parked the truck near the front steps and waited, watching students trickle out in loose, laughing groups toward the parking lot. When Silas finally appeared, he walked fast, head down, clearly hoping to reach the truck without any further incident. He almost made it.
"Hey, farm boy!"
The voice carried easily across the lawn, confident, amused, entirely too pleased with itself. Holt Sinclair jogged up behind him, 2 friends trailing along, phones already lifting halfway. Silas stopped walking, jaw tight. "What?" "Just saying hey," Holt said. "All false innocence. Didn't mean to spook you or anything." His eyes drifted toward the truck, and toward Josie standing calmly beside it. "That your sister?" Silas didn't answer him. Holt closed the remaining distance, grinning back at his friends the whole way. "Man, they really do things different out on the farm, huh?" He reached out casually and flicked the brim of the faded ball cap sitting on the truck's dashboard, the one Josie always wore for field work, knocking it clean out through the open window into the dirt below. It landed hard in a shallow puddle left over from the morning's rain. Mud splashed up one worn side. "Whoops," Holt said, not sounding even slightly sorry about it. His friends laughed, a little too loud, a little too eager. A handful of students nearby slowed their steps to watch, phones lifting further. Silas's hands curled into tight fists at his sides. "Pick it up," he said quietly. Holt raised both eyebrows, clearly delighted by the reaction he'd gotten. Or what, exactly? For a long suspended moment, nobody moved at all. Then Josie stepped forward, calm and entirely unhurried. She crouched down, lifted the cap carefully out of the mud herself, and shook it off with a gentle, practiced motion. She didn't look angry. She didn't look afraid either. She simply looked at Holt, steady and even, the way a person looks at weather they've already decided not to let ruin their day. "I don't look for trouble," she said quietly, "but I don't run from it either, once it comes looking for me." Holt blinked, caught slightly off guard by how calm she managed to sound. "Cute speech," he said, recovering quickly. "You should write greeting cards for a living." A few of his friends laughed again, though noticeably thinner this time, some of the earlier confidence already draining out of the moment. Josie said nothing further. She simply turned, opened the truck door for her brother, and waited patiently beside it. Silas climbed inside, jaw still tight, hands still faintly shaking with anger he hadn't allowed himself to release. Josie walked unhurried around to the driver's side and got in beside him. She set the muddy cap gently on the seat between them, started the engine, pulled slowly away from the curb. They drove in silence for nearly a mile before Silas finally spoke. "You should have said something else," he muttered. "You should have really told him off. Would that have actually helped anything? It would have felt good at least." Josie's eyes stayed on the road ahead of them. "Feeling good and doing the right thing aren't always the same exact target," she said. "Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is nothing at all." "Not yet anyway. That's easy for you to say." "No," Josie said, her voice quieter now. "It really isn't. Trust me on that one." Silas glanced sideways at her, something shifting slowly in his expression. "What actually happened to you out there, Joe?" It wasn't the first time he'd asked her that particular question. It certainly wouldn't be the last. Josie stayed quiet for a moment, watching the fields blur gently past the window. "Things I'm still learning to carry," she said finally. "Same as most people carry things, one way or another. You never really talk about any of it. Not much worth saying that would make real sense to somebody who wasn't actually there for it." Silas let that settle between them for a while. "Grandpa used to say your letters home read like somebody keeping careful secrets," he said eventually. Josie almost smiled at that. Despite everything, Grandpa noticed absolutely everything, whether you wanted him to or not. "He would have hated that kid," Silas said, some heat returning to his voice. "Sinclair. That's his family name, right? Same as the big feed company sign out on the highway. Sounds about right. His dad's supposedly some rich guy, owns half the county, practically, from what people keep saying." Josie filed that particular detail away without comment, quiet and thoughtful. She had a growing feeling it wouldn't be the last time she heard that particular name mentioned. That evening, after chores were finally finished and the sun had dropped low behind the barn, Josie sat on the porch steps, carefully cleaning mud out of the faded ball cap. The stitching had loosened slightly along one worn edge. A small metal pin shaped like a trident sat fixed just above the brim. She turned it slowly between her fingers. It had been a gift once, a long time ago now, from a man named Elias Hutchins, her first real mentor in the service, gruff and steady, the kind of man who never once needed to raise his voice to be heard clearly. He used to say the cap was never really about rank, or recognition, or anything anyone else could see from the outside. It was about remembering exactly who you were, even on your absolute worst day. Elias hadn't made it home from their final deployment together. Josie still wore the cap almost every single day since, quietly, without fanfare. Not for show, simply for memory, and for the promise she'd made herself afterward. She set it carefully on the porch railing to finish drying, and looked out over the darkening fields. Somewhere in the distance, a fox called once, then went entirely silent. The farm settled slowly into its nightly stillness around her. Josie thought about the boy at the college, about the careless ease with which he'd knocked her cap into the mud, about the practiced entitlement of somebody who had never once faced a real consequence in his young life. She thought about her grandfather, gone 3 short weeks now, and the debt papers still sitting unopened on the kitchen table, waiting for courage she hadn't fully gathered yet. She thought about Silas, 18 years old, trying so hard to be strong for the both of them at once. And she thought quietly that patience was its own particular kind of courage. The hardest kind, some days when everything in you wanted to move. She let her mind drift further back, to long summers spent here as a little girl, well before any of this had ever become her responsibility to carry. Her grandfather used to walk the fence line every single evening, checking each post carefully by hand. She'd trail along behind him, barefoot in the warm grass, asking questions he never once seemed to tire of answering. "Why do you check the same fence every single day, Grandpa?" "Because a fence that isn't checked," he'd say, "starts falling down long before you ever notice it happening." Same with people, he'd add sometimes, almost as an afterthought. Same with whole towns, too, if you're not careful. She hadn't understood what he'd meant back then. Not really. She was beginning to understand it now. Earl Calloway had never once been a loud man. He'd never needed to raise his voice to be genuinely heard by the people around him. Around Millbrook, folks had respected him the same way you respect weather, or the changing seasons, something that simply is exactly what it is, without needing anyone's permission to be that way. Josie wondered, sitting there with his unfinished letter still fresh somewhere in the back of her mind, how much of that same quiet strength he tried to pass down to her without either of them ever once naming it out loud. Maybe that was the real inheritance, in the end. Not the land itself, not the debt still sitting unopened, something considerably harder to hold on to, and far more valuable in the long run. She finally rose, joints stiff from sitting too long in the cooling evening air, and went inside to check on Silas, who had fallen asleep in front of the small kitchen television, exhaustion from the long day finally catching up to him completely. She turned the television off gently, draped a blanket carefully over his shoulders, and sat for a moment in the quiet, simply watching her brother sleep. Whatever came next, she thought, they would face it together, the way their grandfather had clearly hoped they would. That much, at least, felt entirely certain. The next morning came early, as mornings on a working farm always seem to. Josie was up well before dawn, moving through chores with the same steady efficiency as always. Feed the animals, check the fence line, fix whatever needed fixing that particular day. Silas came downstairs for breakfast, looking tired. Dark circles gathered beneath his eyes. "Didn't sleep much?" Josie asked, setting a plate down in front of him. "Kept thinking about yesterday," he admitted, rubbing his face. "Don't let one careless kid live rent-free in your head like that." "Easier said than done." "I know," Josie said gently. "Eat your breakfast. We'll figure the rest out as we go." They rode into town together again, the morning fog noticeably thinner than the day before had been. At the college, Silas climbed out, squared his shoulders deliberately, and walked in like a man determined not to let anyone see him rattled. Josie watched him go, then turned the truck toward the small diner on Main Street, the one Vernon had mentioned so warmly the day before. Dot's Diner, the hand-painted sign read, faded red letters against weathered white wood. Inside, the place smelled like coffee and bacon grease, warm and familiar in a way that reminded her faintly of home, wherever home had ever really managed to be for her. A handful of older men sat clustered at the counter, talking low over steaming morning coffee. One of them was Vernon Higgins. He caught her eye immediately and waved her over with a friendly gesture. "Morning," he said. "Didn't expect to see you back in town again quite so soon." "Needed a break from stubborn fence posts," Josie admitted, sliding onto the stool beside him. "Smart woman, taking a breather when you need one." The woman behind the counter, heavy-set with kind, tired eyes, poured Josie a cup of coffee without even being asked. "You're the Calloway girl," she said warmly. "Whole town's been quietly wondering exactly when you'd finally come in for a visit. Word travels fast around here, it seems." "Small town," the woman said, shrugging good-naturedly. "I'm Dot. You need anything at all, you just holler." Josie thanked her, wrapping both hands gratefully around the warm mug. Vernon leaned over slightly, lowering his voice a notch. "Heard there was some trouble over at the school yesterday," he said, "involving your brother from what I understand." Josie glanced at him, mildly surprised. News really does travel fast in this town. "Millbrook's not nearly big enough to keep many secrets for long," Vernon said. "Sinclair boy giving your brother a hard time already?" "Something along those lines." Vernon's expression darkened slightly, something old and tired passing behind his eyes. "That family's had considerably more money than sense, going on 2 generations now," he said. "Roland Sinclair especially. Man's never once met a piece of land he didn't want badly enough to own outright. Sounds like a real charmer, from what little I've gathered. Sits on the college board too, as it happens," Vernon added. "Donates enough money that most folks around here just quietly look the other way when his boy acts up." Josie absorbed that piece of information quietly, filing it alongside everything else she'd already learned in the past 2 short days. "You knew my grandfather a long time," she said carefully. "Did he ever have any real dealings with the Sinclairs, back in the day?" Something flickered briefly across Vernon's weathered face, there and gone again so quickly she nearly missed it entirely. Some, he said carefully, choosing his words with obvious care. Long time ago now. Different story for a different day. Josie didn't push any further. She'd learned, over her years of service, that certain doors opened considerably faster when you didn't try to force them open before they were ready. Fair enough, she said simply. They finished their coffee together, talking about smaller, easier things. The weather turning cooler. The rising price of feed corn. The county fair coming up sometime in the fall. But that brief flicker in Vernon's eyes stayed quietly with her all the same. A small, loose thread she carefully tucked away for later, when the time felt right to pull it. Back at the college, Silas made it through most of the morning entirely without further incident. He kept his head down through class, focused hard on the material, tried his best not to think about the day before. At lunch, he found himself once again near the same quiet girl from the courtyard. This time, she was sitting alone at a picnic table outside, picking absently at a sandwich she clearly wasn't actually eating. Silas hesitated only a brief moment before walking over toward her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She looked up, visibly startled, then shook her head slowly. "Sure. Yeah. Go right ahead." He sat down across from her, unwrapping his own lunch carefully. "I'm Silas," he offered. "Just started here this week." "Della," she said quietly. "I'm fairly new here too, honestly. Well, newer than most people anyway. You from around here originally?" "2 counties over, actually. Moved in with my aunt last year." She hesitated briefly. "Doesn't really matter much, I guess. Everybody already seems to know everybody else around here." "Tell me about it," Silas said, thinking immediately of Holt Sinclair. Della glanced toward the group of students seated at the far table, the same ones who had laughed cruelly at her the day before. "They're not usually quite that bad," she said quietly. "It's mostly just when Holt's around, honestly. He kind of decides how everyone else is allowed to act. I noticed that much already." "You're the one from yesterday," Della said suddenly, recognition slowly dawning on her face. "With the cap incident. And your sister." Sis nodded, jaw tightening slightly at the memory of it. "Word travels fast around this whole town, apparently." "Small school," Della said, unknowingly echoing Vernon's earlier words from that same morning. "Even smaller town." They ate together in comfortable silence for a while. "For what it's worth," Della said eventually, "your sister seemed genuinely tough back there. The way she just calmly picked the cap back up like that. Didn't even flinch once." Silas considered that for a moment. "Yeah," he said slowly. "She's tougher than most people probably realize, I think." "Must be nice," Della said, quiet, almost wistful. "Having somebody like that actually looking out for you." Something in her voice made Silas glance up more carefully. "You don't have anybody like that?" Della shrugged, focusing back down on her sandwich. "My aunt works nights, mostly. I'm on my own a lot of the time." Silas didn't quite know what to say to that, not exactly. But something about her quiet loneliness struck a familiar chord somewhere inside him. "Well," he said finally, "you've got somebody to sit with at lunch now, I guess. If you want the company, anyway." Della looked up, a small, genuinely surprised smile crossing her face. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'd actually like that a lot. It was a small moment, ordinary even in the grand scheme of things. But small moments exactly like that one had a quiet way of mattering considerably more than people realized later on down the road." That same afternoon across town, a very different kind of meeting was quietly taking place. Roland Sinclair sat at the head of a long conference table inside the administrative building of Millbrook Community College, flanked by 2 other board members. The college president, a nervous man named Foster, shuffled papers in front of him that he clearly didn't need to shuffle. "The new agricultural easement," Roland was saying, his voice smooth and entirely confident. "It's a straightforward proposal, really. Expands the college's partnership with Sinclair Agribusiness. Brings genuine investment into this county. It would require access through several private parcels," one board member noted cautiously, "including some smaller farms out along County Road 9. Roland waved a dismissive hand through the air. "Most of those farms are barely breaking even as it stands," he said. "A partnership like this could easily be exactly the lifeline some of these families desperately need right now. Or exactly the excuse to push them out entirely," Foster said quietly, immediately regretting the comment under Roland's sharp, sudden glance. "I'm simply talking about progress," Roland said, smiling thinly. The kind of progress this whole county desperately needs, whether people realize it yet or not. He tapped the folder in front of him, closing the subject cleanly for the moment. Let's revisit this again next month, he said, once a few more details get properly settled. As the meeting quietly adjourned, Foster lingered near the door, watching Roland gather his things with practiced, unhurried ease. That old Calloway property, Foster said carefully. It borders your land, doesn't it? Along the creek there? Roland's expression didn't visibly change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, just slightly. It does, he said simply. Old Earl always was stubborn about that particular water access. Shame what happened to him in the end. His grandchildren have moved in, apparently, Foster added. Granddaughter and grandson, from what I hear. Boys already enrolled here, in fact. Roland paused at the doorway, considering this new piece of information carefully. Is that so? He said quietly, almost to himself. There was nothing overtly threatening in his tone. Nothing anyone in the room could have pointed to directly if pressed. But Foster felt a small, involuntary chill all the same, the particular kind that comes from watching a powerful man quietly recalculate something behind an otherwise perfectly calm face. Interesting, Roland said finally, almost to himself. Very interesting indeed. He left without another word, footsteps entirely unhurried down the empty hallway. That evening, back at the farm, Josie found a small wooden box tucked deep in the back of her grandfather's closet while carefully sorting through his belongings. Inside were old photographs, a pocket watch that no longer ran, and a bundle of letters tied together with faded string. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, untying the bundle with careful fingers. Most of them were entirely ordinary things. Letters from old friends long since gone. A few from her own mother written years ago, well before everything had changed so completely. But one letter, near the very bottom, was different from the rest. It was addressed to no one in particular, written in her grandfather's careful, deliberate handwriting. The kind of letter a man writes when he suspects he might not get another chance to say something important out loud. Josie unfolded it slowly, carefully. If anyone finds this, it began. There are things about this land I never quite got the chance to make right. The water rights along the creek, the one Sinclair's father tried to take from me 30 years back now. I fought it once. Fought it hard, with everything I had. Thought I'd settled the matter for good, at the time. But some fights don't ever really end, not truly. They just go quiet for a while, waiting. If you're reading this, take proper care of this land. Take care of each other, always. And don't ever let anyone convince you that quiet is somehow the same thing as weak. The letter ended there abruptly, unfinished, as though he'd fully intended to write considerably more and simply never found the time before it was too late. Josie sat very still for a long moment, the paper trembling faintly in her hands. Outside, the wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the low, steady hum of crickets settling in for the coming night. She thought of Vernon's careful words from earlier that same morning. Different story, for a different day. She thought of Roland Sinclair's name, spoken twice now, in two entirely different conversations, within the space of a single afternoon. She thought of her grandfather, alone in this very house, quietly carrying some unfinished fight for 30 long years, never once burdening his grandchildren with it, right up until now. Josie folded the letter carefully and placed it gently back inside the box. Whatever this actually was, it clearly wasn't finished. Not yet, anyway. But for the very first time since arriving in Millbrook, she began to understand that the trouble at the college, the careless cruelty of one rich man's entitled son, might be only the smallest visible surface of something considerably older and considerably deeper, running quietly beneath this land the whole time. She thought of what she'd told Silas the evening before. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all. Not yet. She still believed that completely. But she also understood now, sitting there with her grandfather's unfinished words resting in her hands, that not yet would not, could not, last forever. Silas found her there a little while later, standing quietly in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea. "You okay?" he asked, noticing her expression right away. Josie looked up, managing a small, tired smile for his benefit. "Yeah," she said, "just finding out there's considerably more to this place than either of us realized at first." "Good more or bad more?" "Not entirely sure yet," Josie admitted honestly. "Maybe a fair bit of both." Silas sat down carefully beside her, handing over one of the 2 mugs. Grandpa always did like keeping his secrets close, he said quietly. Seems that way, doesn't it? They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the old house settling gently around them. Familiar creaks and groans like the sound of memory itself moving through the walls. Della, from school, Silas said eventually. She's had a genuinely rough time of it too. Different way than us, but still. You made a friend already? Maybe, Silas said, a small smile tugging faintly at his mouth. Feels good, honestly, having somebody else around who actually gets it. Josie looked at her brother for a long, quiet moment, something warm settling gently in her chest despite everything else weighing heavily on her mind. That's good, Silas, she said softly. That matters more than you probably realize right now. Outside, the last light faded slowly from the sky, and the farm settled fully into darkness, quiet and watchful, holding its secrets a little while longer still. Day 3 began the way most days did in Millbrook, with fog low across the fields and roosters calling somewhere off in the distance. Josie was already outside when Silas came down, coffee in hand, quietly running through a mental list of chores. You're quiet this morning, Silas said, grabbing a piece of toast on his way past. Thinking, Josie said simply. About the letter? About a great many things, honestly. They drove into town together again, the routine already beginning to feel familiar, comfortable in a way neither of them had quite expected so soon into this new life. Near the edge of Main Street, a police cruiser sat parked outside the diner, lights off, engine idling quietly. A tall man in a tan uniform leaned against the hood, sipping coffee from a paper cup. He waved as the truck slowed near him. Josie pulled over out of simple small-town courtesy, nothing more. Morning, the man said, walking over unhurried. Roscoe Whitmore. Sheriff around these parts, for what it's worth. Josie Calloway. I know, Whitmore said, not unkindly at all. Word travels fast in a town this size. So I keep hearing from just about everybody. Whitmore glanced briefly toward Silas in the passenger seat, then back toward Josie. Had a report of some stray cattle wandering near the county line last night, he said. Wasn't yours. Don't worry yourself over it. But it's had me driving these particular roads a bit more than usual this week. Anything in particular I should know about? Just keeping an eye on things generally, Whitmore said. Small towns. You learn to notice pretty quick when something feels a little off, even before you can always say exactly what it is. He studied her for a moment the way people sometimes did entirely without meaning to. You served, he said. It wasn't really phrased as a question at all. Josie kept her expression carefully even. Long time ago now. Doesn't look all that long ago to me, honestly, Whitmore said. Something in the way you sit, the way you watch the road, even while you're just talking casually to somebody. Josie said nothing in response, neither confirming it nor denying it outright. Whitmore didn't push any further. Anyway, he said, straightening up. Welcome to Millbrook. Good people here, mostly speaking. A few complicated ones too, here and there. You'll learn who's who soon enough, I expect. Looking forward to it, Josie said, though her tone suggested something a little more complicated than that. Whitmore tipped his coffee cup toward them in a small, informal salute and walked back unhurried toward his cruiser. Silas waited until they'd pulled fully away before finally speaking. He knew, he said, that you served. Just from looking at you for a minute. People notice more than you'd probably think, Josie said. Doesn't necessarily mean much on its own, though. But she found herself thinking about it for the rest of the drive regardless. The quiet, careful way small towns had of watching absolutely everything, and somehow forgetting almost nothing at all. At the college, the morning passed entirely without incident, which felt, to Silas, almost stranger than trouble actually would have. He sat with Della again at lunch, the two of them talking considerably easier now, the earlier awkwardness of the day before mostly gone already. You seem lighter today, Della observed. Feels like it, honestly, Silas admitted. Maybe things are finally starting to settle down a little. He should have known better than to think that out loud, even silently. By the time classes let out that afternoon, a light rain had started falling, turning the gravel lot behind the mechanics' building slick and considerably darker. Silas cut through it on his way to meet Josie, who had come early to help unload a delivery of feed at the co-op down the street. He didn't see Holt and his two friends until they were already close, cutting cleanly off his path near the equipment shed well out of sight of the main building. Farm boy, Holt said, all false friendliness, wanted to have a word. Not really in the mood right now, Silas said, trying to step calmly around him. One of Holt's friends, a broad-shouldered kid named Tucker, shifted quickly to block his path entirely. Come on now, Holt said. No need to be rude about it. Move, Silas said, jaw tightening visibly. Holt's easy smile thinned considerably. Or what exactly, gonna go cry to your sister again? Something in Silas snapped just slightly at that, enough to make him shove forward hard, trying to force his way past both of them. Tucker grabbed his jacket roughly, yanking him back hard, off balance, directly toward a stack of steel pipes leaning against the shed wall. It happened fast, faster than anyone standing nearby could really fully process in the moment. Josie had come around the corner of the shed at exactly that instant, arms full of heavy feed sacks, and dropped them instantly without a sound the second she saw her brother stumbling backward toward the pipes. She crossed the distance between them in under 2 full seconds. One hand caught Silas cleanly by the shoulder, redirecting his fall safely off to the side. The other intercepted Tucker's arm mid-motion, not violently at all, but with a precision that stopped him cold instantly, wrist twisted just enough to make him release his grip and step back, visibly startled. It was entirely over before Holt even fully understood what had just happened in front of him. Silas stood upright again, breathing hard, more startled by his sister's sheer speed than by the shove itself. Tucker rubbed his wrist gingerly, staring at Josie with something between confusion and genuine alarm. What the hell was that? He muttered under his breath. Josie said absolutely nothing. She simply stepped between her brother and the 3 young men, calm and controlled, her expression entirely unreadable. For a long, suspended moment, nobody in the small group moved at all. A few students who had been passing nearby had stopped completely to watch, phones half raised, sensing something happening that they didn't quite understand yet. Holt recovered first, forcing out a laugh that didn't quite land right. Relax, everybody, he said. Just messing around a little. Doesn't look much like messing around from over here, Josie said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud at all. It didn't need to be, not even slightly. Something in it carried anyway, steady and entirely unmistakable, cutting cleanly through the rain and the sudden tension hanging thick in the air. Holt's eyes flicked toward her, and for just one brief moment, something uncertain passed clearly behind them. Whatever he'd genuinely expected from a quiet farm girl, this clearly wasn't it. Come on, guys, he said finally, forcing casualness back into his voice with obvious effort. Let's just go. He turned and walked off, Tucker and the other boy trailing uneasily behind him, throwing nervous glances back over their shoulders the whole way. Silas let out a long breath he hadn't fully realized he was holding. Joe, he said quietly, how did you even do that just now? Josie bent down calmly, picking up the dropped feed sacks, brushing rain carefully off her sleeves. Instinct, she said simply. That wasn't just instinct, and you know it. Let's get you home, she said, not quite fully answering him. But as they walked back together toward the truck, Silas noticed several students still watching them from a distance, whispering quietly among themselves, something clearly shifting in the air around his sister that hadn't been there before that afternoon. Whatever she actually was, whoever she had once truly been, people around Millbrook were finally starting to notice. That evening, Vernon Higgins stopped by the farm again, this time bringing along a sack of ripe tomatoes from his garden as a friendly excuse. He found Josie out on the porch, cleaning tools methodically, the faded ball cap sitting on the railing beside her, still drying from the day's earlier rain. Vernon set the tomatoes down carefully, and his eyes drifted, almost absently, toward the cap resting there. He went completely still. That pin, he said slowly. The trident. Josie glanced up, following his gaze toward it. A friend gave it to me, she said carefully. A long time ago now. Vernon stepped closer, studying it with an intensity that genuinely surprised her. I served 40 years back myself, he said quietly. Different branch entirely. Different conflict altogether. But I know men who wore a pin exactly like that one. Know precisely what it costs a person to earn one. Josie said nothing in response, watching him carefully the whole time. You're naval special warfare, Vern said. It wasn't quite phrased as a question, and yet it wasn't quite pure certainty either, or you served alongside them closely enough to earn the right to carry that. For a long moment, Josie genuinely considered denying it, deflecting the way she usually did with strangers. Something in Vernon's weathered face stopped her cold. Not simple curiosity. Respect. The quiet, entirely unshowy kind that only ever comes from someone who fully understands exactly what a thing like that actually costs a person. "I served," she said finally, simply. "That's genuinely all I usually say to most folks who ask." Vernon nodded slowly, something settling deeply in his expression. Gratitude and quiet understanding mixed together in equal measure. "Didn't need more than that from you," he said. "Just needed to know I wasn't imagining things is all." He reached out and, to Josie's genuine surprise, gave her a small, formal nod, almost a proper salute, brief and clearly unpracticed but entirely sincere all the same. "Whatever brought you all the way out here, Josie Calloway," he said. "Millbrook's genuinely lucky to have you, whether this whole town realizes that fact yet or not." He didn't ask her for anything more. He didn't need to. Some quiet understanding passed between the two of them in that moment, the kind that never really requires much explanation at all. After he finally left, Josie sat alone on the porch for a long while afterward, the cap resting gently in her lap, the trident pin catching the last fading light of evening. She thought of Elias Hutchins, of the quiet promise she'd made herself after he was gone, to live in a way that genuinely honored everything he'd taught her: patience, discipline, the hard-won understanding that real strength rarely ever needed an audience to prove itself to. She thought of Silas, safe inside now, shaken earlier but entirely unharmed. She thought of Holt Sinclair's uncertain eyes in that brief moment by the equipment shed, the very first visible crack in his easy, practiced confidence. Whatever this whole situation was slowly building toward, she understood clearly now that it was only just beginning. Across town, in a house considerably larger than anything Millbrook truly needed, Roland Sinclair sat in his study, a glass of scotch sitting untouched on the desk beside him. Holt stood near the doorway, still faintly damp from the earlier rain, unusually quiet for once. "Tucker said the sister moved like she'd actually been trained for it," Holt said eventually, "like real training. Military maybe, from the look of it." Roland didn't look up from the papers spread out in front of him. "Doesn't matter one bit what she used to be," he said flatly. "Doesn't change anything at all about that land or what eventually needs to happen with it. She embarrassed me, Dad, in front of everybody." Roland finally looked up, something cold and entirely patient settling into his expression. "Then don't let it happen again," he said simply. "But don't back off either, not for a second. People like that, all that quiet dignity of hers, it only works if nobody ever challenges it long enough. Keep pressing steadily. Eventually, everybody breaks under enough pressure." Holt hesitated visibly, something uncertain crossing his face that he quickly smoothed back over. "Yes, sir," he said. Roland returned his full attention to the papers in front of him, a set of survey documents concerning the creek running along the border of Calloway land. "Besides," he added, almost to himself now, barely above a murmur, "some debts simply take longer to collect than others. Doesn't mean they ever really go away entirely." Holt didn't fully understand what his father actually meant by that. He didn't bother asking for clarification. He simply nodded once and left the room, already turning over new ways to save face in front of his friends by morning. Somewhere beneath his obviously bruised pride, something else had quietly taken root that evening too. Small and entirely unacknowledged, a first faint flicker of genuine doubt about the fight he was steadily being pushed into. It would be a long while yet before that doubt grew into anything real or solid, but it had been planted there all the same, whether he realized it yet or not. Somewhere out there, past the fence line, past the creek that ran quietly along the edge of Sinclair land, an old fight that had gone silent for 30 long years was slowly beginning to stir again. Neither Josie nor Silas fully understood that yet. But the peace they had found so quickly in Millbrook, the kind that settles gently over farm country before every dawn, was about to be genuinely tested. There is an old truth, one that people in small towns have generally understood better than most, across many generations now. You cannot always tell the true strength of a person by how loudly they happen to speak. Sometimes the most soft-spoken people are the ones carrying the very heaviest things. A grandfather who checked the same fence every single evening, year after year, never once complaining aloud about the weight of it. A young woman who came home from places she still couldn't fully talk about, and found herself, without a single complaint, starting completely over with nothing but a truck, a trailer, and her brother seated quietly beside her. A boy who sat down with a lonely stranger at lunch simply because he still remembered exactly what it felt like to eat entirely alone. An old man who recognized a small pin resting on a muddy cap and offered nothing back but quiet, genuine respect in return. These are rarely the loud kinds of strength people notice right away. They almost never make headlines, or draw crowds, or demand any kind of applause from anyone. But they are the exact kind that quietly holds a family together, through nearly anything. The kind that holds a whole town together too, when it finally matters most. Millbrook did not yet know what it had genuinely gained the day Josie Calloway first drove down County Road 9, with her brother seated beside her and her grandfather's land waiting patiently ahead. It did not know about the letter hidden carefully in the closet, or the debt still sitting unpaid, or the old dispute over water rights that had never truly ended, only quietly slept for a while. It did not know that a rich man's careless son had just picked a fight with somebody considerably stronger than he could possibly understand yet. All it knew, for the moment, was simply a new family settling into an old farm, keeping mostly to themselves, working hard, asking for almost nothing in return. That would change soon enough in its own time. But for these first few quiet days, that peace was genuinely enough on its own. It was, in its own particular way, a kind of grace. And sometimes, before any real story of justice or reckoning can properly begin, that is exactly where it has to start from. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with patience and quiet dignity, and the simple daily decision to keep showing up, one ordinary day after another. And when the real testing finally came, as it surely and inevitably would, the people of this small town would learn something important about the young woman who had quietly moved in along County Road 9. They would learn that some of the strongest people in this world are the ones who never once feel the need to prove it, until, one day, when it truly matters, they finally do. There is a moment in every quiet fight, a moment when patience stops being enough. Not because the person waiting gives up, but because the other side mistakes silence for surrender. That mistake has a cost. Somebody usually pays it before the truth comes out. This is where that cost begins. Day 4 started with a phone call nobody wanted. Josie was in the barn when her phone buzzed against the workbench. She wiped her hands on a rag and answered. "Miss Calloway? This is President Foster's office, Millbrook Community College." Her stomach tightened before the woman even finished the sentence. "Is Silas all right?" "He's fine," the woman said quickly. "Nothing happened today. President Foster just wanted to speak with you and your brother. At your convenience. About what?" There was a pause, careful and rehearsed. He'd rather explain in person. Josie thanked her, hung up, and stood there a long moment in the quiet of the barn. She didn't like meetings that couldn't be explained over the phone. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, more than once. That afternoon, across town, Holt Sinclair sat in the passenger seat of Tucker's truck, still nursing a bruised ego from 2 days before. "She made me look like an idiot," he muttered, in front of everybody. "So what do we do about it?" Tucker asked. Holt was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the fields rolling past. "We don't touch her," he said finally. "Not directly. Not after that." "Then what?" "The brother," Holt said. "He's the easy one." Tucker glanced over. "Easy how?" Holt smiled, slow and cold. "There's an equipment audit coming up in the ag mechanics shop. Some of that precision tech gear is worth a fortune. GPS units, guidance modules. So things go missing sometimes," Holt said. "Especially from a shop that isn't locked as tight as it should be. Especially if somebody's bag happens to be sitting right there when it happens." Tucker's grin faded slightly. "That's a felony, man. Theft like that." "Not for us," Holt said. "For him." "What if somebody's in there?" "Late study session, cleaning crew, anything. Building's usually empty by 9, Holt said. "We'll be quick." Tucker drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, weighing something silently. "I don't know, Holt. Feels different than the other stuff. Pranks, whatever. This is real trouble if it goes sideways." "It won't," Holt said, more confidence in his voice than he actually felt. "My dad's got half the board in his pocket anyway. Nothing sticks to us in this town. Never has." He said it lightly, almost bored, the way a person says something they haven't fully let themselves think through. Tucker didn't argue. He never did, not really. That was the trouble with people like Tucker. They didn't start the fire. They just handed over the matches. Josie and Silas sat across from President Foster that evening, in an office that smelled like old carpet and stronger coffee than necessary. Foster shuffled papers he clearly didn't need to shuffle. "I wanted to speak with you both before rumors got ahead of the facts," he began. "There's been some tension between your brother and a few other students." "We're aware," Josie said evenly. "I want to be clear," Foster continued. "The college takes student conduct seriously. On all sides." "On all sides," Josie repeated. "Does that include the Sinclair boy?" Foster's jaw tightened slightly. "Every situation is handled according to the facts available," he said carefully. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give right now," Foster said. Silas shifted in his seat. "Sir, with respect, Holt started every bit of this." "I understand that's your perspective," Foster said. "I simply want you both to know I'm watching the situation closely." "With respect, sir," Josie said. "Watching closely hasn't done much for my brother so far." Foster set his pen down, folding his hands together on the desk. "I've worked at this college for 11 years, he said, a note of weariness creeping into his voice. "I've watched a great many families come through here, some with money, some without. I'd like to think I treat them all the same." "Would you?" Josie asked, not unkindly but directly. Foster met her eyes for the first time since they'd sat down. "I'd like to think so," he repeated, quieter this time, as though even he wasn't entirely certain of the answer. Josie studied him, the careful phrasing, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the door, as though he expected someone to walk in and correct him. "Mr. Foster," she said quietly, "who exactly are you afraid of disappointing here?" The question landed harder than she'd intended. Foster didn't answer directly, but something in his expression flickered. "Just be careful," he said finally. "Both of you. That's all I'm asking." They left his office a few minutes later, neither of them satisfied, both of them uneasy in a way they couldn't quite name yet. That night, Della stayed late in the agricultural mechanics building, finishing a lab report due the next morning. The building was mostly empty by 9, just the hum of old fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of settling metal. She liked it that way, actually, quiet enough to think. She was packing up her things around 10 when she heard a noise from the equipment storage room down the hall. A soft scrape, a muttered curse. She should have called someone right then. Instead, curiosity got the better of her, and she walked toward the door, cracked it open, and looked inside. 2 shapes moved in the dark, working quickly at one of the storage cabinets. She recognized Tucker's voice before she recognized his face. "Hurry up," he whispered. "Grab the module and let's go." Della froze in the doorway. One of them turned, saw her silhouette, and panicked. "Who's there?" She stumbled backward, trying to run, but her foot caught the edge of a rolling cart. It toppled with a crash, sending tools clattering across the concrete floor. Someone shoved past her in the dark, hard enough to knock her into the metal shelving. Pain shot through her wrist as she hit the ground, glass from a broken gauge case scattering near her hand. By the time she managed to sit up, breath ragged, the room was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. A janitor found her 10 minutes later, pale and shaking, cradling her wrist, blood dotting her sleeve from a shallow cut. "Who did this?" he asked, already reaching for his radio. "I don't know," Della said, voice trembling. "It was dark. I just saw someone. Maybe 2 people. Anything you remember? Height? Hair? Anything?" Della hesitated, trying to force the blurred shapes in her memory into something solid. "Tall," she said finally. "One of them was tall, light hair maybe. It wasn't much, but it was enough, later, to point in a direction nobody intended and everybody assumed." Silas had left his backpack in that same building earlier that evening, forgotten after a study group, planning to grab it first thing in the morning. By the time campus security reviewed the scene, his bag sat exactly where Tucker had made sure to leave it, tucked beside the very cabinet that had been broken into. One of the missing GPS guidance modules zipped inside the front pocket. Silas didn't even know it was missing until 2 officers found him at the truck the next morning, badges out, expressions grim. "Silas Calloway? That's me. We need you to come with us. There's been a theft reported. And an assault." The word assault hit him like a physical blow. "An assault? What happened? Is somebody hurt?" "A student was injured last night in the mechanics building," the officer said. "Your bag was found at the scene, with stolen equipment inside it." Silas felt the ground shift beneath him. I wasn't even there last night. I left before dark. We'll need you to explain that during questioning, the officer said, not unkindly, but firmly all the same. Josie arrived 20 minutes later, having been called the moment campus security pulled Silas aside and found her brother sitting in a small administrative office, pale, hands shaking slightly in his lap. "Joe," he said the second she walked in. "I didn't do this. I swear I didn't." "I know," she said simply, sitting beside him. "They're saying I hurt somebody. I know. They found stuff in my bag, Joe. Stuff I've never even seen." Josie put a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then we prove that," she said quietly. "One fact at a time. Not with anger, with proof." But even as she said it, she felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest, the sense of watching something unfair unfold in slow motion, powerless to stop it in the moment. Some fights, she knew, could not be won by force, only by patience and evidence and time. By that afternoon, Foster had issued an interim suspension, pending a formal hearing before the college's disciplinary board. "It's standard procedure," he told Josie, avoiding her eyes, "given the severity of the allegations." "He hasn't been convicted of anything," Josie said. "He hasn't even been formally charged." "I understand your frustration," Foster said, "but a student was injured. The board needs time to review everything properly." "And when is that hearing?" Foster checked a calendar on his desk. "The evening of Founders' Day," he said. "Same night as the community celebration downtown." It seemed like a natural date given the board's usual schedule. Josie absorbed that quietly. 5 days, she thought. 5 days to prove her brother's innocence, in a town that had known him for less than a week. "There's something else," Foster added, almost reluctantly. "Miss Hartwell, the student who was injured, mentioned seeing someone tall, with light hair. It's not conclusive, but combined with the location of the backpack, you're telling me a scared, injured young woman gave you a vague description in the dark," Josie said. "And that's become the entire foundation of this case?" Foster didn't have a good answer for that. He rarely did, these days. That evening, Josie sat at the kitchen table, long after Silas had gone to bed, the wooden box from her grandfather's closet open in front of her. She'd read the unfinished letter a dozen times already. Water rights along the creek. Sinclair's father, 30 years back. A fight that had gone quiet but never truly ended. She needed more than a half-finished letter. She needed proof. Digging deeper into the box, she found an old game camera, the kind hunters and farmers used to track coyotes near the cattle pens. A small note was taped to the side, in her grandfather's handwriting. "Still recording. Check memory card every few months. Some things worth keeping an eye on." Josie stared at that note for a long time. Her grandfather had never struck her as a man who watched wildlife for sport. She retrieved the memory card, borrowed Silas's laptop, and began scrolling through months, then years, of grainy black and white footage. Deer, raccoons, a fox once, trotting along the fence line at dawn. And then, buried among the ordinary footage, something else entirely. A date stamp from 18 months earlier. 2 men in reflective vests, walking the creek bed late at night. Flashlights sweeping across the water, one of them holding a clipboard, the other operating what looked like a surveying instrument. A truck idled nearby, just visible at the edge of the frame. Josie paused the footage, leaned closer. The truck's door bore a faint, familiar logo. Sinclair Agribusiness. Her pulse quickened. She kept scrolling. More footage, spaced months apart, always at night, always the same 2 men, always along the same stretch of creek that marked the boundary between Calloway land and Sinclair land. Somebody had been surveying this property for a long time. Quietly, carefully, without permission. The next morning, Josie drove into town before sunrise, footage saved carefully on a small drive in her pocket, and headed straight for Vernon Higgins's farm. She found him in his kitchen, coffee already brewing, unsurprised to see her so early. "Figured you'd come around eventually," he said, waving her inside. She showed him the footage on Silas's laptop, watching his face carefully as the 2 men appeared on screen. Vernon's expression hardened. "That's Sinclair's surveying crew," he said. "Recognize the logo anywhere. Why would they be surveying our land at night? Without permission?" Vernon sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Told you before," he said. "Different story for a different day. Guess today's that day." He poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down heavily across from her. 30 some years back, he began. Your grandfather and Roland's father, old Whit Sinclair, got into it over water rights along that creek. Whit claimed some old survey gave him access. Earl fought it in county court. Won eventually. But it cost him near everything he had, legal fees and all. What happened to the original documents? Filed at the county recorder's office, far as I know, Vernon said. Should still be there. Public record. You remember anything specific? Names, dates, anything that could help? Vernon thought for a long moment. There was a surveyor, he said finally. Fellow named Dale Pruitt. Old man now, if he's even still alive, might remember more than the paperwork does. Josie thanked him, finished her coffee, and drove straight to the county recorder's office. Footage and grandfather's letter tucked carefully in a folder on the passenger seat. The recorder's office occupied a small, quiet room in the county courthouse. Shelves lined floor to ceiling with old ledgers and file boxes. A clerk named Marion helped her locate the relevant property records, pulling a thick folder marked Calloway Sinclair Water Rights, County Road 9. Josie spread the documents across the table carefully. Most of it was dense legal language, difficult to parse. But one page stopped her cold. A deed amendment dated some 30 years earlier, transferring partial creek access rights from Calloway land to Sinclair land. Signed, apparently, by Earl Calloway himself. Josie stared at the signature for a long moment. Something about it looked wrong. Too neat, too careful. Nothing like the looping, hurried scrawl she'd seen on dozens of her grandfather's letters and notes over the years. She pulled his old letter from her folder, laid it beside the deed amendment, comparing the signatures side by side. They didn't match, not even close. "Ma'am," Josie said carefully, "is there any way to verify a signature like this? Confirm whether it's authentic?" Marion frowned, examining the documents herself. "We're not handwriting experts here," she said, "but you're welcome to request a certified copy. Take it to an attorney. That kind of thing does happen, unfortunately. More than folks would like to think." Josie requested copies of everything, thanked her, and left the courthouse with a folder considerably heavier than the one she'd walked in with. She had a forged signature, trespassing footage spanning years, an unfinished letter hinting at a fight that had never truly ended. It wasn't proof of everything yet, but it was proof of something. And something, she reminded herself, was more than she'd had 2 days before. Vernon's mention of the old surveyor stayed with her the rest of that afternoon. Dale Pruitt, he'd said, might remember more than the paperwork does. A little digging through the phone book at the library turned up an address on the far edge of the county, a small house near a stand of cottonwood trees. Josie drove out that same evening, folder of documents on the seat beside her. The man who answered the door was well into his 80s, thin, stooped, but sharp-eyed behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "Dale Pruitt? Depends who's asking. Josie Calloway, Earl Calloway's granddaughter." Something shifted in the old man's face, softening slightly. "Earl's girl," he said. "Been a long time since I thought about that name." He invited her in, settled her at a small kitchen table cluttered with seed catalogs and old newspapers, and listened patiently as she laid out the documents in front of him. He studied the deed amendment for a long moment, holding it close to his glasses. "I surveyed that creek boundary myself," he said finally. "Back in the day. Original lines put the full access on Calloway land. Always did." "This says otherwise," Josie said, tapping the amendment. "Dated a few months after your original survey." Pruitt frowned, looking closer. "That's not my signature verifying this amendment," he said. "Somebody used my name here. I never certified any change to that boundary. Never would have. The water rights were clear as day. Would you be willing to say that officially, on the record?" Pruitt looked up at her, something steady and certain in his old eyes. "Earl Calloway was a good man," he said. "Fought fair his whole life. Somebody tried to cheat him once, and I always figured it never sat right with anybody who knew the truth." He reached for a pen and a blank sheet of paper. "Write down what you need from me," he said. "I'll sign it." Long past time somebody did. Josie thanked him, gathering the notarized statement carefully into her folder alongside everything else. It wasn't the whole fight, not yet, but it was one more piece of solid ground beneath her feet. Word of Silas's suspension spread through Millbrook faster than Josie had expected. By the time she stopped at Dot's diner that afternoon, Dot's usual warmth had cooled several degrees. "Heard about your brother," Dot said, setting down a coffee without quite meeting Josie's eyes. Terrible thing. That girl getting hurt like that. He didn't do it, Josie said quietly. I'm sure you believe that, Dot said, in a tone that made clear she wasn't entirely convinced herself. A few regulars at the counter glanced over, then quickly looked away. Josie left most of her coffee untouched. Outside, she passed two women on the sidewalk, their conversation dropping to a whisper the moment they noticed her, eyes following her a beat too long as she walked to her truck. Small towns, she was learning, could turn as quickly as weather. Warmth one day, suspicion the next. At the feed co-op later that afternoon, she ran into a farmer named Hollis Radner, a heavyset man who'd waved to her cheerfully just days before, admiring the condition of her fence work along County Road 9. Today, he barely nodded, busying himself with a stack of feed bags instead of meeting her eyes. Afternoon, Hollis, Josie said anyway. Afternoon, he said, shorter than before. Something on your mind? Hollis hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but unable to stop himself. Just surprised is all, he said. Seemed like good quiet folks, you and your brother. Hate to hear about all this trouble. My brother didn't do anything wrong, Josie said evenly. Neither did I. Sure, Hollis said, in the careful tone of a man who didn't quite believe her, but didn't want an argument either. Hope it all gets sorted out. He turned back to his feed bags, conversation clearly finished. Josie paid for her supplies in silence, carried them to the truck, and sat for a moment behind the wheel, feeling the weight of a dozen small, careful dismissals pressing down on her at once. None of them had raised their voice. None of them had accused her outright, but the distance was unmistakable all the same. A quiet closing of doors that felt, in its own way, heavier than shouting ever could have. She thought of her grandfather's words in the unfinished letter. Don't let anyone convince you that quiet is the same thing as weak. She held on to that, driving home along the familiar stretch of County Road 9, the fields gold and endless on either side, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. Silas spent most of that same afternoon alone in his room, staring at his phone, replaying the last 2 days over and over in his mind. Around 6, a text came through from a number he didn't recognize. This is Della. Got your number from a friend in class. I'm so sorry about all this. I told them it wasn't clear. I didn't say it was you. He stared at the message a long moment before answering. Not your fault. You got hurt. That's what matters. They keep asking me the same questions, she wrote back. I don't know what to say anymore. I didn't see faces. Just shapes in the dark. I believe you, Silas typed. I know you're not trying to hurt me. There was a long pause before her next message arrived. I don't think you did this. I just want you to know that. Whatever happens with the hearing, I don't think it was you. Something in Silas's chest eased slightly, reading those words. It wasn't proof. It wasn't enough to fix anything. Not yet. But it was something steady to hold on to, in a week that had offered him very little steadiness at all. Thank you, he wrote back. That actually means a lot right now. I wish I could do more, Della replied. I'm still trying to remember more clearly. If I do, I'll say something. I promise. Silas set the phone down, staring at the ceiling for a long while afterward. Grandpa Earl used to say that most people were decent deep down, even when circumstances made them slow to show it. He was starting to believe that might be true even here, even now. That same evening, Roland Sinclair sat in his study once more, reviewing a short written statement Tucker had provided at his quiet request. It described in careful detail an encounter 2 days earlier near the equipment shed. A version of events in which Josie Calloway had grabbed Tucker's arm without provocation, twisted it painfully, and made what the statement called an implied threat against Holt's safety. None of it was entirely true. All of it was carefully worded to sound as though it might be. Roland read it twice, satisfied, then picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. Sheriff Whitmore, he said pleasantly, once the call connected. Roland Sinclair. Got a moment? For you? Always, Whitmore said, though something careful entered his voice. There's a concerning matter I think you should look into, Roland said, involving the young woman out on the old Calloway place. My son's had a rather frightening encounter with her. Frightening how? Physical intimidation, Roland said smoothly. A witness statement, if you need it. I'd hate for something worse to happen before anyone takes it seriously. Whitmore was quiet for a moment on the other end. I'll look into it, he said finally, carefully neutral. I appreciate that, Roland said. This town takes care of its own, Sheriff. I trust you'll handle it the right way. He hung up, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile. 2 birds, he thought. One quiet, troublesome family, and one stubborn old land dispute, both problems solved by the same careful pressure, applied in exactly the right places. He had learned over many years that most people broke eventually. It was simply a matter of finding where to push. Holt sat in his room that same night, staring at his phone, Tucker's written statement still open in a message thread between them. He hadn't asked his father to draft it quite so carefully. He hadn't asked for any of this, not really, not the way it had actually unfolded. He thought about Silas, suspended now, probably sitting somewhere just as sleepless as he was. He thought about Della, hurt, scared, caught in the middle of a plan he'd set into motion, without ever fully picturing her in it. He hadn't meant for anyone to actually get hurt. That was what he kept telling himself, anyway. A knock came at his door, and his father stepped in without waiting for an answer, the way he always did. "Everything's arranged with the sheriff," Roland said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "This will blow over soon enough. Best thing you can do now is stay quiet, let it run its course." "Della got hurt, Dad." Roland waved a dismissive hand. "Accidents happen. Not our concern, so long as the right person answers for it." "The right person," Holt repeated slowly. "Is that Silas, though? Really?" Roland's expression sharpened. "Careful," he said. "Don't let a guilty conscience start writing. Checks your future can't cash." He left without waiting for a response, closing the door firmly behind him. Holt sat alone in the quiet afterward, phone still in his hand, Tucker's careful, dishonest words glowing faintly on the screen. For the first time since any of this had started, he felt something other than pride, or anger, or the easy confidence he usually wore like a second skin. He felt faintly, unmistakably ashamed. He didn't know yet what to do with that feeling, but it sat there all the same, small and stubborn, refusing to leave. Whitmore hadn't slept well the night before he drove out to the Calloway farm. He'd been sheriff in Millbrook for going on 15 years, long enough to know exactly how these situations usually went. A powerful man made a phone call. A complaint got filed, worded just carefully enough to sound serious. And somebody with less money, less standing in town, found themselves suddenly explaining their every move to a stranger with a badge. He didn't like that pattern. He'd never liked it, not since his first year on the job, watching an old rancher get pushed off land. He'd worked his whole life because somebody wealthier wanted it more. But disliking a pattern and having the power to stop it were 2 very different things. He thought about Josie Calloway, the steady way she'd answered his questions on the side of the road just days before, the quiet economy of her movements, nothing wasted, nothing performative. He'd met plenty of veterans over the years. He recognized something in her he didn't often see, a kind of discipline that didn't need an audience to prove itself. Roland Sinclair, on the other hand, he'd known for going on 20 years, and had never once seen him make a phone call without an angle attached to it somewhere. Whitmore poured himself a second cup of coffee that morning, staring out his kitchen window at the gray, gathering clouds, and made himself a quiet promise. He would follow this complaint exactly as far as the truth actually led it. No further. No matter whose name was attached to the other end of the phone. Day 7 arrived cold and overcast, clouds hanging low over the fields. Josie was in the barn when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside, unfamiliar in rhythm, careful and deliberate. She stepped out to find Sheriff Whitmore's cruiser parked near the house, the man himself standing beside it, hat in hand, expression unusually grave. "Sheriff," Josie said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Something wrong?" "Afraid there might be," Whitmore said. "Got a complaint filed against you yesterday. Physical intimidation. Threatening behavior toward a student." "From who?" "Tucker Reeves," Whitmore said, backed up in a roundabout way by Roland Sinclair himself. Josie felt something cold settle in her stomach, though her expression remained steady. "That's not what happened," she said. "I stopped a young man from shoving my brother into a stack of steel pipes. That's all." "I believe you might be telling the truth," Whitmore said carefully. "But I've got a formal complaint, a witness statement, and a fair amount of pressure from certain corners of this county to take it seriously. So what happens now?" "I need you to come down to the station," Whitmore said. "Answer some questions. Officially, on the record." Silas appeared in the doorway behind her, having heard the last part of the exchange, face pale. "This is insane," he said. "She protected me. That's all she did." "I understand this is difficult," Whitmore said, glancing between them. "But I've got a job to do, same as always. Doing this the right way protects everybody, including your sister." Josie placed a steadying hand on Silas's arm. "It's all right," she said quietly. "We do this the right way, same as everything else." She looked at Whitmore, calm despite the storm, gathering quietly behind her eyes. "I'll come," she said, "but you should know something first." She retrieved the folder from the kitchen table. The trespassing footage, the mismatched signatures, the unfinished letter from her grandfather, and handed it to him. "While you're investigating me," she said, "maybe somebody should look into this too." Whitmore glanced through the folder slowly, his expression shifting from careful neutrality to something far more serious. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather's things," Josie said, "and an old game camera nobody thought to check in years." Whitmore closed the folder carefully, tucking it under his arm. "I'll look into everything," he said. "Everything, Miss Calloway. I give you my word on that." But, even as he said it, the reality of the moment settled heavily over the farm. Josie would still have to go into town, sit across from officers who didn't fully trust her, answer questions about an encounter she'd only ever meant to protect her brother. Meanwhile, word of the complaint would spread through Millbrook exactly as quickly as word of Silas's suspension had. Faster, probably. By the time Josie climbed into the cruiser that afternoon, several neighbors had already gathered near their mailboxes and fence lines, watching in careful silence as she was driven past. Nobody waved. Nobody called out a greeting. The quiet that had once felt like peace now felt like something else entirely. Something colder. Something closer to judgment. Back at the station, Josie sat across a small table from two officers, answering the same questions in careful, measured detail, over and over. What happened at the equipment shed? Why she'd reacted the way she had? Whether she'd meant to hurt Tucker, intimidate Holt, threaten anyone at all? "Walk me through it again," the younger officer said, pen hovering over his notepad. "From the beginning. My brother was being shoved toward a stack of steel pipes," Josie said. "I redirected his fall and stopped the other young man's arm before anyone got hurt." "That's the entire encounter, mister. Reeves says you twisted his wrist deliberately. Says you threatened him." "I applied enough pressure to make him let go," Josie said. "Nothing more. And I never threatened anyone. I said maybe 6 words the entire time." "What were those 6 words?" "That it didn't look like messing around." The older officer, quiet until now, studied her carefully. "You've had training," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have. Military?" "Yes." "What branch?" Josie held his gaze evenly. "That's not something I discuss in casual conversation," she said, "but I'm happy to provide service records if that would help clear this up faster." The two officers exchanged a glance. "That would help," the older one admitted. "Then I'll have them to you by tomorrow morning," Josie said. She answered each question calmly, honestly, without embellishment. It didn't seem to matter. She could see it in their eyes, the same uncertainty she'd seen in Dot's, in the neighbors by their mailboxes, in Foster's careful, evasive phrasing. A story had already taken shape in this town, days before she'd ever had the chance to tell her own version of it. A story about a stranger who'd moved in quietly, then turned out dangerous. A story that fit neatly into whatever fears people already carried about outsiders. About veterans nobody fully understood. About quiet people who might be hiding something behind all that silence. It was, Josie realized, almost exactly the kind of story someone like Roland Sinclair would want people to believe. Simple. Convenient. Untrue. Silas waited outside the station for nearly 3 hours, alone on a bench beneath a gray, unmoving sky. He watched people come and go through the front doors, none of them looking his way, most of them careful not to. At one point, Vernon Higgins's truck pulled into the lot, and the old man climbed out slowly, making his way toward the bench without hesitation. "Figured somebody ought to sit with you," Vernon said simply, easing himself down beside Silas. "You heard, then?" "Whole town's heard," Vernon said. "Whole town's got opinions too, most of them wrong." "You don't think she did anything wrong?" Vernon looked at him steadily. "I think your sister stopped a boy from hurting you," he said. "I think Roland Sinclair's been looking for a way to run your family off that land for 30 years, and he finally found one that looked convenient. Why would people just believe him, though? They don't even know us. Fear's an easier story than patience, Vernon said. Always has been. Takes courage to wait for the truth. Most folks would rather have an answer today, even the wrong one, than sit with not knowing a while longer. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the gray afternoon settle over the parking lot. She's not going to give up, Silas said eventually, more to himself than to Vernon. Whatever happens in there. No, Vernon agreed. I don't expect she will. When Josie finally emerged, she looked tired in a way he'd rarely seen, not from lack of sleep, but from something heavier. What happens now? He asked, standing. They're reviewing everything, Josie said. No charges yet. Might not be any if the evidence I gave them holds up. And if it doesn't? Josie didn't answer that directly. She simply put an arm around her brother's shoulders, steering him toward the truck. We keep going, she said. One day at a time. Same as always. They drove home in silence, the fields darkening slowly around them as evening approached, storm clouds thickening on the horizon. Neither of them spoke about the whispers they'd both noticed in town that day. The careful distance in people's eyes. The sense, unmistakable now, that Millbrook had quietly decided something about them before either of them had been given a fair chance to explain. That night, Josie sat alone on the porch long after Silas had gone to bed, the faded ball cap resting on her knee, the trident pin catching what little moonlight slipped through the clouds. 5 days, Foster had said. 5 days until Founder's Day, until the disciplinary hearing, until whatever this land dispute had been building toward for 30 years finally came due. 2 of those days were already gone. She thought of her grandfather's words again, turning them over slowly in her mind, the way she once turned over mission briefings, looking for the detail everyone else had missed. Some fights don't ever really end. They just go quiet for a while. She understood now, more fully than she had even a few days before, exactly what he'd meant. This fight had never truly ended. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for someone strong enough and stubborn enough to pick it back up. Josie looked out over the dark fields, toward the creek she couldn't see but knew was there, marking a boundary some men had tried to erase 30 years ago, and were trying to erase again now. She thought of Della, hurt and frightened, caught in the middle of something she'd never asked to be part of. She thought of Silas, suspended, humiliated, waiting for a hearing, stacked against him before it had even begun. She thought of the careful, cold distance in the eyes of people who barely knew her, already convinced of a story that wasn't true. It would have been easy, in that moment, to feel defeated. Easy to believe that patience and quiet dignity had gotten her nowhere, except further into trouble. But Josie had learned, in places far harder than Millbrook, that the moment things looked most lost was rarely the moment they actually were. It was simply the moment before the truth finally had a chance to catch up. She closed her hand gently around the trident pin, feeling its small, familiar edges beneath her fingers. Somewhere out there, a forged signature sat waiting to be examined properly. Somewhere out there, an old surveyor named Dale Pruitt might still remember exactly what had happened 30 years ago. Somewhere out there, a scared young woman named Della Hartwell knew more than she'd yet had the courage to say out loud. And somewhere out there, a boy named Holt Sinclair was beginning, slowly, to understand the weight of what he'd helped set into motion. None of it was resolved yet. None of it would be, not for a few more days. But Josie Calloway had faced worse odds than a small town's suspicion and a rich man's careful lies. She simply hadn't faced them here before. Not yet. The wind shifted, carrying the first cold hint of the coming storm across the fields, rattling gently against the old porch boards her grandfather had walked 1,000 times before her. Somewhere beneath that same quiet sky, in 3 more days, this whole story would finally come due. And when it did, Millbrook would learn that some debts, no matter how long they'd been allowed to sleep, always found their way back to daylight eventually. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being doubted by people who barely know you. It is different from grief, different from fear. It settles quietly, in the space between a neighbor's careful nod and the words they don't quite say. Josie had felt many kinds of hardship in her years of service. Exhaustion that reached into her bones. Loss that never fully healed. But this particular ache, the ache of watching a whole town quietly decide who you were before you'd been given a fair chance to show them otherwise, was its own kind of difficult. She thought about Della, injured and frightened, doing her best to tell the truth despite the fog of that night. She thought about Silas, 18 years old, suspended from a program he'd barely begun, carrying a burden that wasn't his to carry. She thought about Holt, somewhere across town, wrestling with something she couldn't see yet, but suspected was there all the same. Not every person who did wrong meant to. Not every mistake came from cruelty alone. Sometimes it came from fear or pride, or the simple failure to imagine the weight a careless choice might place on someone else's shoulders. She thought, too, about her grandfather and the fight he'd carried quietly for 30 years, never once burdening his grandchildren with the full truth of it, choosing instead to leave them only a letter, unfinished, and a camera, still recording, patient enough to wait for someone ready to look. Maybe that patience was its own kind of gift. Maybe some truths needed time to surface on their own schedule, no matter how badly the people waiting wanted them sooner. Josie rose from the porch steps eventually, joints stiff from the cold, and went inside to check the lock on the front door, an old habit that had never quite left her. Tomorrow she would call in favors, gather statements, drive out to speak with anyone else who might remember what had truly happened 30 years ago. Tomorrow she would keep fighting, quietly, patiently, the only way she knew how. Tonight, she allowed herself simply to sit with the weight of it, unresolved, uncertain but not, she reminded herself firmly, without hope. Some fights took longer than others. Some truths took longer to surface, but they surfaced all the same, eventually, for anyone patient enough and stubborn enough to keep digging until they did. Every town has a night it remembers, a night people talk about for years afterward. Not because of fireworks or music or the usual reasons a festival gets remembered, but because something true finally came out into the open. Millbrook was 2 days away from that kind of night. Nobody there knew it yet, except, perhaps, one quiet young woman, still gathering the last pieces she needed. The past week had cost the Calloways more than either of them wanted to admit out loud. A brother suspended from a program he'd barely begun. A sister questioned like a suspect in a town that had barely learned her name. A community, once warm and welcoming, gone cold and careful almost overnight. But cost, Josie had learned long ago, was not the same thing as defeat. Sometimes it was simply the price of doing something worth finishing. Day 8 began with a phone call Josie had been waiting for. "Miss Calloway, this is Officer Dawson from the Sheriff's Department. We received your service records this morning, and the complaint against you has been closed," Dawson said. "No charges. Sheriff Whitmore reviewed everything personally. Wanted me to let you know himself, but he's been tied up most of the morning." Josie exhaled slowly, feeling something loosen in her chest for the first time in days. "Thank you for calling," she said. "There's something else," Dawson added. "The sheriff also wanted you to know he's opened a formal inquiry into the land documents you provided and the security footage from the mechanics building." "What kind of inquiry?" "The kind that takes these things seriously," Dawson said. "He asked me to tell you he'll be in touch before Founders Day." Josie thanked her again and hung up, standing quietly in the kitchen for a long moment. One weight had lifted. Several more remained. Silas found her there a few minutes later, still holding the phone. "Good news?" he asked, hopeful. "They dropped the complaint against me," Josie said. "No charges." Silas let out a breath he'd clearly been holding for days. "That's something," he said. "That's actually something real." "It is," Josie agreed. "But your hearing's still in 2 days. We need to be ready." "Ready how?" "We've got Della's messages, the footage, the letter. Is that enough?" Josie considered that carefully. "It's enough to raise real doubt," she said. "Whether it's enough to clear you completely, I don't know yet. Foster's going to want something harder than doubt." Silas sat down at the kitchen table, rubbing his eyes. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "Study group ran long, and I just walked out without my bag. Didn't even notice until the next morning. If I just grabbed it, none of this happens." "Don't do that," Josie said gently. "Do what?" "Blame yourself for somebody else's choice to hurt people," she said. "That's their weight to carry, not yours." Silas looked up at her, something steadying in his expression. "You really believe that?" "I've had to," Josie said quietly. "More than once." That same morning, Della sat in her aunt's kitchen, staring at her phone, the messages from Silas still open on the screen. She'd barely slept the past week, replaying that dark room over and over, trying to force the blurred shapes into something clearer. A knock at the door startled her. Sheriff Whitmore stood on the porch, hat in hand, expression gentle but purposeful. "Miss Hartwell? Got a few minutes?" "Nothing to worry about. Just want to go over a few things again, if you're willing." Della let him in, sat across from him at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. "I know you've already answered a lot of questions," Whitmore said. "I promise this is the last time I'll ask for now." "It's okay," Della said. "I want to help. I just don't remember much." "Take your time," Whitmore said. "Sometimes details come back sideways when you're not trying so hard to force them." Della closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back to that dark room, the crash of the cart, the shove that sent her into the shelving. "There was a smell," she said slowly, eyes still closed. "Cologne, maybe. Really strong. I remember thinking it didn't smell like anything Silas wears. He doesn't wear cologne at all, actually." Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "Would you recognize that smell again?" "Maybe," Della said. "I don't know. It's just a feeling. Not really proof of anything." "Feelings point us somewhere," Whitmore said. "Proof does the rest. We'll take both." He thanked her, gathered a few final notes, and left with a small, encouraging nod. Della sat alone afterward, turning the memory over again, something clearer finally starting to surface beneath the fog. That afternoon, campus security supervisor Ray Whitfield called Whitmore with news that shifted everything. "We finally got eyes on the outdoor camera by the loading dock," Whitfield said. "Missed it the first time because it's on a separate system. Caught two figures leaving through the side exit that night." "Can you make out faces?" "Not clearly," Whitfield admitted. "But one of them's wearing a varsity jacket with a number on the back. We cross-referenced the equipment list from that jacket style. Only a handful of students have one like it this semester." "How many?" "Two," Whitfield said. "Tucker Reeves and Holt Sinclair." Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. "Send me everything you've got," he said finally. "And Ray, keep this between us until the hearing. I don't want anything spooked before then." "Understood, Sheriff." Whitmore hung up, sat back in his chair, and allowed himself, for the first time in days, a small measure of grim satisfaction. The truth had a way of surfacing eventually. It simply needed someone patient enough to wait for it. That same afternoon, wanting more than paper to stand on before the hearing, Whitmore drove out to see Dale Pruitt himself. Pruitt greeted him at the door without much surprise, as though he'd expected a visit sooner or later. "Figured somebody official would come around eventually," he said, waving Whitmore inside. "Josie Calloway showed me your statement," Whitmore said, settling at the same cluttered kitchen table. "Wanted to hear it from you directly. Official capacity." Pruitt nodded, folding his hands together. "I surveyed that creek boundary in the spring, the year Earl's youngest daughter got married," he said. "Remember it clear as anything, because I had to reschedule twice on account of flooding. And the amendment, the one bearing your name?" "Never certified it," Pruitt said flatly. "Never even saw it until Josie brought it to my door. Somebody forged my signature alongside Earl's. Whoever did it knew enough about surveying to make it look convincing to somebody who wasn't paying close attention. Would you testify to that? Formally, if it comes to it?" "Already signed a statement," Pruitt said. "Happy to say it out loud, too, if it helps set things right. Earl Calloway was a good neighbor. Man like that deserves better than having his name forged after he's gone." Whitmore thanked him, made careful notes, and drove back toward town with considerably more confidence than he'd left with that morning. Sometimes, he reflected, the truth wasn't hiding at all. It was simply waiting for someone to bother asking the right question of the right person at the right time. Day 9 arrived bright and unusually warm. The kind of day that made Founders' Day preparations feel almost festive despite everything hanging over it. Banners went up along Main Street. Vendors set up booths near the town square. A stage was assembled near the courthouse steps, ready for speeches, music, and the county council's evening vote. Josie spent the morning reviewing every document one final time, laying it all out across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. The unfinished letter, the forged deed amendment, Dale Pruitt's notarized statement, the trail camera footage, and now, according to a brief, careful call from Whitmore that morning, security footage placing Holt and Tucker at the scene. It wasn't everything. But it was close. Close enough, she hoped, to finally tip the scales toward the truth. Across town, Holt sat alone in his room again, the weight of the past 9 days pressing down harder than he'd expected it to. He'd barely spoken to his father since the night Roland dismissed Della's injury so casually. He'd barely spoken to Tucker either, both of them avoiding the subject entirely, as though silence alone might make it disappear. His phone buzzed, a text from Tucker. Heard campus security got new footage. We need a story straight before the hearing tomorrow. Holt stared at the message for a long time before responding. What story? The true one. Or another lie? Don't be an idiot, Tucker wrote back. Your dad's got half the board. We just stick to what we already said. Holt set the phone down, walked to his window, and looked out over the manicured lawn below, the kind of view that had always made him feel, without quite realizing it, entitled to things other people had to earn. He thought of Della, hurt and frightened, still uncertain who had done that to her. He thought of Silas, suspended, his family's name dragged through town gossip for something he hadn't done. He thought of Josie, calm and unshaken, even while an entire town turned against her, simply because his father had made one phone call. Something in him, buried under weeks of pride and easy privilege, finally cracked. He didn't know yet what he would do with that crack, but for the first time, he wanted badly to do something right. Downstairs, his mother, Vivian Sinclair, stood near the kitchen window, watching Roland pace the length of his study through the open door across the hall. She'd heard enough fragments over the past 9 days to piece together more than either of the men in her family realized. You're pushing him too hard, she said quietly, when Roland finally emerged for coffee. I'm protecting this family's name, Roland said, same as I always have. Are you? Vivian asked. Or are you protecting a piece of land you've wanted since before Holt was even born? Roland's jaw tightened. That land should have been settled 30 years ago. Would have been if Earl Calloway hadn't been so stubborn about it. Maybe he was right to be stubborn, Vivian said. Maybe some things aren't yours to take just because you want them badly enough. Roland set his coffee down harder than necessary. You don't understand business, Vivian. Never have. No, she agreed, something tired and sad entering her voice. But I understand our son, and I've watched him get quieter every day this week. That's not nothing, Roland. That's a boy carrying something he shouldn't have to carry. Roland didn't answer that. He simply picked up his coffee again and walked back toward his study, closing the door a little more firmly than he needed to. Vivian stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment afterward, worry etched deep into her expression, wondering, not for the first time, how much longer she could stay quiet about the things she'd started to suspect were true. That evening, Vernon Higgins stopped by the farm, finding Josie and Silas going over notes at the kitchen table. Tomorrow's the day, he said, settling into a chair. You ready as we can be, Josie said. Foster agreed to make the hearing open, Silas added, since I requested it. Figured if we've got nothing to hide, no reason to hide it. Vernon nodded approvingly. Smart move. Sunlight's got a way of changing a room's mood. You think people will actually show up? Silas asked. This town loves an audience, Vernon said, with a small, knowing smile, especially on a day already set aside for one. He reached into his jacket, produced a small folded paper, and slid it across the table. Wrote this out myself, he said. Statement about what I know. About that pin on your cap, about the man who wore one like it that I served alongside, years back. Figured it might carry some weight, coming from somebody who's lived here 40 years. Josie read it over, something tightening in her throat. Vernon, you don't have to do this. I know I don't, Vernon said simply, doing it anyway. He rose, patting Silas on the shoulder on his way to the door. Get some sleep, both of you, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long one. Founder's Day arrived with a sky so clear it seemed almost deliberate, as though the whole county had agreed to put its best face forward. By early afternoon, the town square filled with families, food stands, and the low hum of a bluegrass band tuning up near the courthouse steps. Children chased each other between quilt stalls and jars of honey. Farmers compared corn yields over paper plates of barbecue. Somewhere near the gazebo, a group of veterans from the county post set up a small folding table, handing out little paper flags to anyone who walked by, the same quiet ritual they performed every single year, mostly unnoticed, entirely unbothered by that fact. Josie walked past that table on her way through the square that afternoon, and one of the older men nodded to her, unprompted, the way Vernon had that first week on the farm. She nodded back, said nothing, and kept walking toward the lecture hall, folder tucked carefully under her arm. Some things, she thought, didn't need to be said out loud to be understood. But the real gathering, the one that mattered most, was scheduled for 6 o'clock in the community college's largest lecture hall, the only room big enough to hold an open disciplinary hearing. Josie and Silas arrived early, folder in hand, and found the room already filling faster than either of them expected. Vernon sat near the front, statement folded in his jacket pocket. Dot from the diner slipped in quietly near the back, offering Josie a small, uncertain nod. Even Hollis Radnor showed up, standing awkwardly near the door, as though unsure whether he had the right to be there at all. Della arrived with her aunt, pale but steady, taking a seat close enough to the front that Silas caught her eye and managed a small, grateful smile. At exactly 6 o'clock, President Foster called the hearing to order. 5 board members seated at a long table at the front of the room. Roland Sinclair sat among them, composed, confident, clearly unaware of exactly how much the room already knew. Holt sat near the back with his mother unusually quiet, hands clasped tightly in his lap. By 6:15, every chair in the hall had filled, and latecomers stood along the back wall and beneath the exit signs, the murmur of 100 quiet conversations settling into an expectant hush as Foster rapped his gavel once. "This board is convened," he said, "to review the disciplinary matter concerning Silas Calloway in an open session at the student's own request." He glanced up, briefly, at the size of the crowd, something uncertain crossing his face before he continued. "Let the record show all parties are present." The hearing opened with a formal reading of the complaint against Silas, theft of college equipment, and by association, the injury sustained by Della Hartwell. Foster then turned the floor over for response. Josie rose first, calm, steady, exactly the way she'd learned to walk into rooms full of people who didn't yet understand what she was capable of. "My brother didn't take anything," she said, voice carrying clearly through the hall, "and he didn't hurt anyone. I'd like to present evidence supporting that." She laid out the trail camera footage first, projected onto the screen at Foster's request, the 2 surveying figures walking the creek bed at night, the Sinclair agribusiness logo unmistakable on the truck door. A murmur moved through the crowd. Roland's expression flickered, just slightly. Next, Josie presented the deed amendment, the mismatched signature, and Dale Pruitt's notarized statement, read aloud by Vernon himself, his weathered voice steady and unhurried. "I surveyed that boundary myself," Vernon read, quoting Pruitt's words. "The signature on this amendment isn't mine, and it isn't Earl Calloway's either. Somebody forged both." The murmur grew louder. Before sitting back down, Vernon unfolded a second paper from his jacket pocket, the one he'd brought to the farm days earlier. "If the board will permit one more thing," he said. "Not evidence for the theft, exactly, but relevant, I believe, to why certain people in this county have worked so hard this past week to discredit this family." Foster nodded him on. "I served this country 40 years back," Vernon said. "Different branch, different conflict than whatever Josie Calloway carries with her. But I know men who wore a pin like the one on her cap. Know what it costs to earn one. She's never once claimed anything to me directly, never bragged, never asked for so much as a thank you. But this town ought to know it's been doubting somebody who's already given more to this country than most folks doubting her ever will." He folded the paper again, sat down beside Silas, and said nothing further. For a moment, the room simply sat with that, quiet in a different way than before, something closer to shame settling over more than a few faces in the crowd. Foster called for order, though his own composure had clearly begun to slip. "This is compelling," he said carefully, "but I fail to see how a land dispute connects to the theft allegation against Silas Calloway." Josie held his gaze evenly. "Because the same family has motive to see my brother discredited," she said. "And I think you know that better than most people in this room, Mr. Foster." Foster's composure faltered for the first time all evening. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said. "I think you are," Josie said, not unkindly. "I think you've felt pressure this whole week from someone on this very board to handle my brother's case a certain way, regardless of the facts." The room went very quiet. Foster glanced toward Roland, then back toward the crowd, something visibly shifting behind his eyes. "There have been," he said slowly, choosing each word with obvious care, "conversations over the years about certain donors' expectations. I won't pretend otherwise, not tonight." Roland's head snapped toward him. "Foster." "I'm done pretending, Roland," Foster said, something almost like relief entering his voice. "This board deserves the truth. So does this family." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, louder this time, the sound of a room recalculating everything it thought it understood. Foster turned back toward Josie, steadier now than he'd been all week. "You said that Sheriff has additional evidence," he said. "I think this board would like to hear it." All eyes turned toward the side entrance, where Sheriff Whitmore had just stepped inside, a folder tucked under his arm. "I apologize for the interruption," Whitmore said, walking to the front of the room. "Given the seriousness of tonight's proceedings, I felt this couldn't wait." He set a second, thinner folder on the table first. "Before anything else, I want to close a loop for this board," he said. "Miss Calloway offered her service records to my office earlier this week, during an entirely separate matter. Those records came back confirmed, through official Navy channels. She served 8 years as a Special Warfare Operator, Naval Special Warfare Command. 2 combat deployments, a Bronze Star with Valor device, for actions that saved 3 members of her unit." A hush moved through the room, different from the murmurs before it, something closer to reverence. "I mention it," Whitmore continued, "only because this board has spent a week treating this family as a question mark. They aren't one. I'd ask the board to remember that going forward." He set the thinner folder aside and opened the one he'd carried in with. "Campus security recovered footage from an outdoor camera the night in question," he said. "One previously overlooked. It places 2 individuals leaving the mechanics building shortly after Miss Hartwell was injured." He held up the first image. "One of them is wearing a distinctive varsity jacket," Whitmore continued, "matched through equipment records to exactly 2 students this semester." The room had gone completely silent. "Tucker Reeves," Whitmore said, "and Holt Sinclair." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Roland shot to his feet. "This is absurd. My son had nothing to do with any theft." "Sheriff Whitmore," Foster said carefully, "do you have anything more conclusive than a jacket?" "We do," Whitmore said. "A partial fingerprint recovered from the stolen equipment. It doesn't match Silas Calloway. It's a partial match to Tucker Reeves, on file from a prior minor incident." Roland's face had gone pale, though his voice remained sharp. "Circumstantial," he said. "None of this proves my son was involved in anything." Josie turned toward Della, who sat frozen in her seat, eyes wide. "Della," Josie said gently, "would you be willing to share what you remembered about the smell that night?" Della hesitated, then rose slowly, voice shaking but clear. "There was cologne," she said. "Really strong. I remember it because it made my eyes water a little, even in the dark." She looked, almost involuntarily, toward the back of the room, toward Holt. "It smelled like the cologne Holt wears," she said quietly. "I noticed it before in class. I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure, but I'm more sure now than I was." The room turned as one, toward the back row. Holt sat frozen, his mother's hand tightening on his arm. His father's furious eyes locked onto him from across the room. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Holt stood slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor in the silence. "It's true," he said, voice unsteady but audible. "All of it. I planned it. Tucker helped me. We wanted to get Silas kicked out. Didn't think anyone would actually get hurt." "Holt," Roland snapped, "sit down now." Holt didn't sit. "I'm not doing this anymore, Dad," he said, louder now, something breaking loose in his voice. "You told me to keep pushing. You told me it would blow over. It didn't blow over. Della got hurt. Silas lost everything for something he didn't do." He turned toward Della, toward Silas, toward the room full of people watching him with a mixture of shock and something closer to relief. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I'm really sorry. To both of you. I was wrong." Roland stood, face red with fury and something close to panic. "This hearing is compromised. My son is clearly distressed, not in his right mind." "Sit down, Roland," Foster said, an unfamiliar firmness entering his voice for the first time all evening. "This hearing will proceed according to the facts, all of them. The next 20 minutes unfolded quickly, the way dammed water finally rushes once the first crack gives way. The board voted unanimously to clear Silas of all charges, reinstating him immediately. Whitmore formally opened an investigation into Tucker Reeves, and separately, into the forged land documents connected to Roland Sinclair, promising a full report to the county prosecutor within the week. Tucker, still seated near the back of the room, looked as though he wished the floor might simply open beneath him. Whitmore walked over quietly, spoke a few low words, and Tucker rose, following him out a side door without protest, the fight already gone out of him. One of the board members, a quiet woman named Patricia Ames, motioned for Roland's immediate removal from the board, citing conflict of interest and conduct unbecoming a trustee. The vote passed, 5-0, Roland himself too stunned to offer more than a weak protest before the room's attention moved entirely past him. He stood slowly, gathering his things with none of the composure he'd walked in with, and left through the same side door, alone, nobody quite meeting his eyes as he passed. Outside, word of what had happened spread through the Founders Day crowd almost as quickly as it had unfolded inside the lecture hall. By the time the county council gathered on the courthouse steps for their scheduled vote on the Sinclair land development, half the crowd already knew the story, whispered from booth to booth, growing more detailed with each retelling. The council chairman, visibly uncomfortable, requested a delay. Given tonight's revelations, he said carefully, this council believes further review is warranted before any vote proceeds. The development, everyone understood without needing it spelled out, was as good as dead. A local reporter, notebook already half filled, caught Whitmore near the courthouse steps. Sheriff, can you confirm the extent of the investigation into Sinclair agribusiness? I can confirm it's ongoing, Whitmore said carefully, and that it will go exactly as far as the evidence leads, without exception for anybody's name or standing in this county. It wasn't a dramatic statement, but coming from a man who'd spent 15 years quietly keeping the peace in Millbrook, it carried more weight than most people in that crowd had ever heard him speak with before. Josie found Della afterward standing near the edge of the crowd, looking shaken but lighter than she had in days. Thank you, Josie said, for finding the courage to say what you remembered. Della managed a small, tired smile. I should have said something sooner. You said it when it mattered most, Josie said. That's what counts. Silas appeared beside them, still processing the whirlwind of the past hour. I don't even know what to feel right now, he admitted. Relief, probably, Josie said. Give it time. The rest will sort itself out. Della looked between them, something warm settling into her expression despite everything. For what it's worth, she said, I'm glad you two moved to town, even with all this. Silas laughed, tension finally breaking loose in his shoulders. Yeah, he said. Me too. Most of it anyway. Holt found them a short while later, standing awkwardly at a distance until Silas noticed him and gave a small nod, permission enough to approach. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, Holt said, but I mean it. What I did was wrong. All of it. Silas studied him for a long moment. You could have stayed quiet tonight, he said finally. Let it all land on Tucker, on your dad's lawyers, whatever. You didn't. Didn't feel right anymore, Holt said. Hadn't for a while, honestly. Watching your sister, watching how she handled everybody doubting her, and she never once tried to make anybody else look worse to make herself look better, made me realize how small I'd been acting. That's a hard thing to admit, Silas said. Especially in a room like that one. Wasn't as hard as staying quiet would have been, Holt said. Not anymore. He turned to Della. I'm sorry you got hurt. That was never supposed to happen. I know that doesn't make it okay. No, Della said quietly. It doesn't. But thank you for saying it. Out loud in front of everyone. That took more than most people manage. I meant to apologize sooner, Holt admitted. Kept telling myself there'd be a better time. There wasn't ever going to be one, I guess. Just had to do it. Della studied him a moment, something softening slightly in her expression. I hope you mean it, she said. Really mean it. Not just because you got caught. I mean it, Holt said. I've got a long way to go to prove that, I know. But I mean it. Holt nodded, shoulders slumping slightly with the weight of everything still ahead of him, the consequences he hadn't yet fully faced. For what it's worth, Josie said, the fact that you stood up tonight, in front of everyone, in front of your own father, that took something. Don't waste it. Holt looked at her, something like gratitude flickering across his face. "I won't," he said. "I'm going to try not to, anyway." He walked off slowly toward his mother, who waited near the edge of the square, her expression a complicated mixture of heartbreak and quiet pride. Later that evening, as the Founders' Day festival wound down into its final hours, string lights flickering on above the town square, Vernon found Josie standing near the edge of the crowd, watching the last of the bluegrass band packing up their instruments. "Quite a night," he said, handing her a cup of cider. "Quite a week," Josie said. "Your grandfather would have been proud," Vernon said, "watching you finish what he started." Josie looked down at the faded ball cap in her hands, turning it slowly, the small trident pin catching the string lights above. "I keep thinking about what he wrote," she said. "About quiet not being the same thing as weak." "Man knew what he was talking about," Vernon said. Dot approached them then, cautious but warm, offering Josie a small paper bag. "Peace offering," she said. "Fresh biscuits. And an apology if you'll take it. Should have trusted my own judgment about you two, instead of listening to gossip." Josie accepted the bag and the apology with an easy nod. "Water under the bridge," she said. "Everybody's allowed a little doubt now and then. What matters is coming around eventually." Dot smiled, relieved, and moved off to rejoin her family nearby. Hollis Radnor approached next, hat in hand, offering an apology of his own, awkward but sincere, before retreating quickly back into the crowd. One by one, throughout the evening, the town found its way back. Foster found Josie near the edge of the square as the crowd began to thin, hands shoved into his coat pockets, looking older than he had that morning. "I owe you an apology too," he said. "More than one, probably." "You did the right thing tonight," Josie said. "Eventually." "Eventually," Foster repeated, something rueful in his voice. "I should have done it sooner. I let pressure make decisions that facts should have made instead. Not proud of that." "Most people don't get tested the way you were this week," Josie said. "Doesn't excuse it. But it happens." "I'm recommending stronger conflict of interest policies for the board," Foster said. "Starting Monday. Figured you'd want to know Silas's suspension will also be wiped from his record entirely. Full reinstatement, no asterisks." "Thank you," Josie said. "That matters. To both of us." Foster nodded, extending a hand which Josie shook firmly. "For what it's worth," he added, "your brother's a good student, good kid. This town's lucky to have your family in it, whether it always acts that way or not." He walked off toward his car, shoulders a little straighter than they'd been in days. A few days later, once the dust had settled and Silas had returned fully to his classes, Vernon suggested something to Dot at the diner, an idea that quickly caught on around town. By the following week, a small glass case had appeared near the diner's front counter, holding a single item inside. Josie's old ball cap, cleaned and pressed, trident pin polished until it gleamed. A small brass plaque beneath it read simply, "In honor of those who serve quietly and the courage it takes to wait for the truth." Josie hadn't asked for the display. She hadn't wanted the attention. Not really. But standing there the first time she saw it, Silas beside her, Della and Vernon nearby, she allowed herself, finally, a small, genuine smile. Some fights ended in daylight, exactly the way her grandfather had once written. This one finally had. That same week, word reached the farm through Whitmore that the county prosecutor's office had opened a formal fraud investigation into the decades-old deed amendment, with additional scrutiny into more recent survey activity along the creek. Roland Sinclair resigned from every remaining civic position he held within days, before anyone could formally ask him to. The Sinclair Agribusiness Board, eager to distance the company from scandal, quietly withdrew the development proposal altogether, citing what a brief statement called an abundance of caution regarding recent community concerns. Tucker Reeves accepted a plea arrangement for his role in the theft and the injury to Della, agreeing to community service, restitution, and a lengthy suspension from the college, pending review for future readmission. Holt avoided formal charges, given his cooperation, and the fact that the physical injury to Della had come from Tucker's actions rather than his own, though the college placed him on academic probation and required both a public service commitment and regular counseling as conditions of his continued enrollment. He accepted every condition without complaint and, according to Della herself, showed up early to his very first service shift at the county food pantry, saying little, working quietly, the way people sometimes do when they are still learning how to carry a mistake honestly. Vivian Sinclair filed for a legal separation from Roland less than a month later, citing irreconcilable differences that, according to town gossip, had been building for considerably longer than anyone outside their household had ever realized. Millbrook, as small towns do, absorbed all of it slowly, turning the story over at diner counters and church socials for months afterward, each retelling smoothing a few more edges, the way stories always do with time. But underneath the gossip, something more lasting had shifted too. A little more caution now, before believing the loudest voice in the room. A little more patience now, before deciding who someone truly was. That evening, Josie and Silas sat together on the porch of their farmhouse, the field stretching gold and quiet toward the horizon, the fence line their grandfather had walked for so many years standing solid once more against the coming dusk. "You think this is really over?" Silas asked. "The land stuff, the investigation, all of it?" "The investigation will take time," Josie said. "Roland's got a lot to answer for. But the worst of it, the part that could have broken us, that's behind us now." "Feels strange," Silas admitted. "Being believed. After everybody doubted us so fast." "People are quick to doubt," Josie said. "But they're capable of coming around too, if you give the truth enough time to reach them." Silas was quiet for a while, watching the last light fade over the fields. "Grandpa would have liked Della," he said eventually. "And Vernon standing up like that." "He would have," Josie agreed. "He always did trust people more than they usually expected." "You never told me exactly what you did over there," Silas said carefully. "Not the details, anyway." Josie was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "Someday I might," she said. "Not because this town needs to know. Because you're my brother, and some things are easier to carry when somebody you love understands the weight of them." "Whenever you're ready," Silas said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I," Josie said. "Not this time." Silas smiled at that, small and genuine. The first easy smile she'd seen from him in what felt like a very long stretch of hard days. "You know," he said, "for somebody who kept telling me patience was the strongest thing, you sure moved fast when it counted. At the shed, at the hearing." "Patience isn't the same as standing still," Josie said. "Sometimes it's just waiting for the moment that actually calls for movement, instead of wasting yourself on every moment that doesn't." "Grandpa should have written that one down too." "Maybe I will," Josie said. "Someday, for whoever comes after us." They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening settled fully around the farm, crickets rising in the grass, the porch light flickering on automatically as the sky darkened. Josie thought of Elias Hutchins, of the lessons he'd taught her about patience, about quiet strength, about the discipline of waiting for the right moment, instead of forcing one before it was ready. She thought of her grandfather, and the fight he'd carried alone for 30 years, finally laid to rest not through anger, but through evidence, patience, and the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on what was true. And she thought, watching her brother beside her, safe now, steady now, that whatever came next for the Calloway farm, they would face it the same way they'd faced everything else, one ordinary day at a time, together. There is a lesson small towns like Millbrook learn slowly, sometimes only once every generation, that the loudest people in a room are rarely the strongest ones in it, that real courage often looks like patience, held steady through difficult days, that dignity, once nearly lost, can still be recovered, given honest people willing to stand up when it finally matters. Josie Calloway never set out to teach anyone that lesson. She simply lived it, quietly, one ordinary day after another, until the truth finally caught up to everyone else. And on the night it did, beneath the string lights and the fading music of a small town festival, Millbrook remembered something it had perhaps always known, deep down, but had needed reminding of all the same, that the quietest people you meet are often carrying the heaviest, most honorable things, and that some debts, no matter how long they sleep, always find their way back to daylight in the end. Somewhere out on County Road 9, a fence line still needs checking every evening. A young woman still walks it most nights, quiet, watchful, at peace in a way she hadn't been in a long while. A young man still studies late into the evening, a little more sure now of who he wants to become, and a little more grateful for the sister who never once let him carry his hardest days alone. An old veteran still stops by most weeks, bringing tomatoes nobody asked for, and conversation nobody quite realized they needed. And in a small glass case near the counter of an ordinary diner, on an ordinary street, in an ordinary town, a faded cap with a small trident pin sits quietly on display. Not as a trophy, not as proof of anything anyone still needs to prove, simply as a reminder, for anyone who happens to look closely enough, that the quietest people in a room are often the ones worth trusting the most, and that somewhere, in every generation, in every small town across this country, there is someone exactly like Josie Calloway. Patient, steady, quietly, unmistakably strong, waiting if it ever comes to that for the moment the truth finally needs someone brave enough to stand behind it.